Well, hello everyone. Here we are with, I guess, homeschool help. It's what we would at least call it. It's certainly on parenting and homeschool and learning and all the various topics we love to deal with and encounter as uh, parents of homeschoolers, people we've seen 5 kids all the way from birth to college, homeschool. Jody's taught in both public and private school. I've taught university level, high school level, uh, and some other level. Um, the the fact today, I want to address this particular question, and I'd love to hear from you if you're there. Tell us where you're from, what's going on. Cheers, pass this along. So we're live and we're wanting to think a little bit about balance. And this topic is quite interesting, I think, to me because it's been such a common theme throughout my history and maybe in the history of America. It's common for people to want to talk about balance. I went to a school back. One of my educational backgrounds was in theology and Bible, and I went to a school called Dallas Theological Seminary, and there's a very well-known professor there named Charles Ryrie, and he had written a book called Balancing the Christian Life. It was about balance, and the joke at school was that if you answered balance on any test for anybody, you'd get a B anyway. So it was just kind of the thing to do, balance. Well, what about balance? Are your kids balanced? Are you balanced? What would a balanced homeschool look like when they grow up? Are they balanced? I think these questions are important and somewhat misunderstood because I think we're busy with a bad definition and we don't really appreciate the importance of working on our weaknesses. I've talked about that recently. So what we do is our kids are out of balance and we say, well, that's just how they are, instead of letting them learn how to get to a new place. And if a question strikes you about this topic as I'm walking through it in the few minutes ahead, hey, write the question up and let me answer it online. Let's watch this interaction. There are no dumb questions, isn't that right? Just unasked ones or something. So I'm Dr. Fred Ray Lybrand, and I want to talk to you today, especially homeschoolers, about balance, specifically how a balanced homeschool balances your kids. Now, I'll tell you up front, our conviction of what we wanted in our homeschool, and those of you who know us know we've stressed this, is we wanted to raise, grow, rear, produce happy adults. That's what we're aiming for. Happy kids would be great too, and we were for that, but we wouldn't sacrifice a happy adult for a happy kid. So happy kids, sometimes you give them their way. They don't feel like doing stuff they really need to do for their own benefit. So you yield to that, and that produces a happy kid for a moment, but it doesn't produce a happy adult long term because they're undisciplined. And in my experience, they turn around and, resent you eventually. So this balance thing, let me tell you what we're not really talking about. Like the common attack in homeschooling or on homeschoolers, one of them is that our children are not socially adjusted. It's not that that's clearly defined. And then you take exceptions of people who are isolated from the world and are in some subcult category out there, and they homeschool, so they're bad people. And that's what all homeschoolers are like, which is silly. I mean, you could say all public school kids are in gangs. They're not, but I think some are. All public school kids are, and you just fill in the blank, doing drugs. No, but some are. All public school kids come in with guns and shoot people. No, but some have. Tragedy, right? So look, that's a misnomer, a misguided idea. And so we're not talking about balance or you making sure they're learning to be socially adjusted or something like that. but something far more profound. It's not about like practical knowledge. Or some people really like practical knowledge, so they want their kids to learn about machinery and repair work and hard work and the farm and raising things. I have friends that do that, organic farms, stuff like that, which is all great, versus intellectual. So some are all on the intellectual side and not much on the uh, practical side, if we might say it. And even though that might be a balance issue, what we're not trying to do is point out to you, if you're all into one of them, then you ought to add the other. That's not what I'm talking about. It's something at a much higher level I want to discuss with you. So hang in there with me and let's think about it. So what is balance? What is balance? Just think about that, or type in a definition. What is balance? I'm going to argue that balance is the right amount of the right thing. So, if you ever had like green beans with no salt or V8 with no salt, we're not going for 50% salt, 50% green beans, 50% salt. That's not balance. Balance is the right amount of the right thing. And when you put the right amount of salt in green beans or V8, maybe it's too much or whatever, but in that moment, it tastes a whole lot better because it's the right amount of the right thing. And when you do recipes, it's that, right amount of tarragon or cumin or whatever you're putting in there. And so knowing that idea that we want the right amount of the right thing, it's not always equal amounts of each thing. It's the correct amount. So this all goes back really to the Greeks, what I want to get to. Because I'm going to argue there are three things that you want to balance. And I don't exactly follow the Greeks, but sort of. And appreciating this, these were pretty much some of the masters of education. I mean, you think about Athens. It was a town of 100,000, it was about the size of the county I grew up in, Alabama. And it produced Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, who tutored Alexander the Great, and I hadn't even started, and they were kin to each other. It was a really amazing phenomenon, what they were doing with education and their culture and democracy in some form, and eventually what they turned into in terms of even conquering the world. So in their mind, in Greek mind, there's old education and higher education. And so the old education was the more traditional ways, and they tried to balance what they called pretty much the intellect and the gymnasium. And so they were trying to balance the mind and the body. So they wanted intellectual development, but they thought as important was the physical development. Now, part of this was because, like with Troy on the extreme, you're going to have to go to war. So people need to be in shape and coordinated and know how to wield weapons and such like that. So some of that was, I think, part of the story of the Olympics and all the rest they developed. But that was old education. It was a balance of intellect in the gym. And so they're balancing the mind and the body. And I think that's useful. In the course of time, higher education with the Greeks turned into really the intellect only or way superior. And so their argument was eventually the intellect would even avoid wars or control outcomes, etc. So higher education, we do that now. We talk about higher education. So the further up you go, in elementary school and high school, you have gym classes. I guess in college, I don't remember taking any, but I guess some curriculum requires it. There are classes you can take, archery, running, frisbee golf. I don't know. They have classes on everything. But higher education is really thought of in that category. It's more research, thought, philosophy, argumentation, debate, etc. It's a much different thing. So even the Greek world began to get away a little bit from the balance that they had originally. And so what I'm arguing is, in prepping your kids to be happy adults, there's going to be a balance issue in view between three categories, okay? Now, you may know the traditional view of the Greek world in classical education, Roman II, was the trivium, especially. So you had data level, logic level, and rhetoric level. And that's a good example of balance inside of the category of intellect. And so what happens is you want to develop kids who can understand the pieces, the data, and then the logic, how it fits together. And then what do you do with it? How do you rhetorically communicate, etc.? And when this balance isn't in place, it generates a problem. So I work with a lot of engineers. I have for a long time. And engineers are a lot of fun. I always kid them that their big problem is that I came up with a word to describe what engineers do, and it's overcomplexificate. So I'll tell them, you guys overcomplexificate things. So I used a word that kind of hit the point. And yeah, what I look back and I think when I taught communications at the University of Alabama, this intro class that I taught to the area of communication, the engineers had about one class outside of engineering that they were required to take, and it was my class. It was not my class, but the Intro to Communications class. And it was because they knew they needed to learn to communicate. And I've done a lot of work with actuaries and engineers, et cetera. And as a population, they're not that good at communicating. They're not good at simplifying and making the points clear and using a story and illustrating and doing the things that engage people in listening. So when you find an engineer who can communicate well, it's a bit of an exception. They tend to inundate you with the data points. They overcomplexificate. I'm not picking on engineers, but if you think about it, it comes about by this lack of balance. They're so immersed in the design, mathematical, engineering principles type of the game, they just really don't develop on the communication side. And that's what balance would be for them, to bring that up. And the ones that I've worked with that are interested in that learn to get better at communicating. And we stress that and help them think it through. So when I get to balance in your homeschool, here are the three things that I think, this is my modern interpretation of what basically the Greeks and history has shown us. It may be my bias, but my bias is something to share with you. And if you think it's helpful, go for it. And it works like this. It gets down to three things. The intellect, right? And the, exercise, I'm going to call it, instead of the gymnasium. So we got intellect and exercise. And then I'm really splitting something off of what the Greeks sort of included there, because in our culture and world, it needs to be defined in a separate way. I'll explain why in a moment. And that would be the arts. So intellect, exercise, and the arts. Those are the three things to balance. Those are the three things we tried to focus on, balancing the right amounts of the right thing. So if you think about these things, the intellect, exercise, and the arts, they're all important. They're all necessary. But why? So intellect is kind of obvious, even though a lot of homeschoolers, I think, neglect this. They kind of slide by and let their kids kind of do as well as they can. They assume they can't learn, so they don't really learn how to blossom that child. A lot of these kids will blossom later. They get into a world that challenges them and their intellect shows up. And so they really learn and blossom in some dramatic ways. I had a good friend who didn't find out he was dyslexic until in his master's program. And once he found it out and got a little help, he blossomed. So that's the way the game goes. But the intellect would be, things like learning how to, the intellect is like learning how to understand, process, figure out how things work, hold information, memory. All of these things are connected there. How to think more cleanly and exactingly and effectively for any particular discipline. It includes things like research, and it can include certainly further things like rhetoric, persuasion, communication, etc. It is important because it's what we would call learning. And so the three R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, those are especially related to crystallizing the brain's ability to understand information, process it, and make use of it in communicating with others. So that's the intellect. It's really important. And honestly, those skills of reading, writing, and arithmetic, as we've discussed, are plenty. On the other hand, the exercise is important as well. I mean, just long term, learning how to balance yourself can probably help you from injury. You can watch these fail army things on YouTube, and you see a lot of this stuff is just people who are not athletic trying to do something athletic. They crash into something and break it and falls apart. Well, that's what you would expect. So getting a child to start exercising, moving their body, running, throwing a ball, or it's a basketball or baseball, it might be a frisbee, it could be beanbags for all I care. But all those coordination things affect how they look, how they walk, how they carry themselves, how they can, if need be, defend themselves, how effective they are at driving a car. Keeping their balance is certainly part of it. And then you grow up and you have children, and if you don't have any of that developed, how do you play ball with your own kids? How does that work? And so, what we notice in some of our more heady children, they tended not to be as prone to the exercise game. So we'd get them outside to play, but we'd make them practice throwing a ball. They all got involved in scouts since they learned about hiking, and then scouts had them, tying things together and building things, etc. So there was a measure of that. To the degree that you can do mechanical things, we weren't good at that, imbalance there. But that too is the use of your hands, the hands-on, the understanding of what physicality is and living in a physical world and touching things and balance and perspective. And all of that is part of the development of the human being. Well, then there's this last little part called the arts. And I say it's a separate thing for a very important reason, because you'll see in the public education system, when money gets tight, etc., they cut the arts. So in our culture, for some reason, music and painting and sculpting and drama, and even to some degree, I'd say imaginative literature, these things somewhat have fallen on, I guess you'd call it hard times, wouldn't you? That these things are add-ons. Really? They're add-ons. So my conviction is actually the arts are part of what teach us about especially creativity. In fact, I would understand the arts are the most creative game. In fact, the great scientists who really grasp and learn things like Faraday and, well, they're modern day, but a Faraday or a Einstein or a Tesla, if you study these people, they were doing all this stuff visually in their head, and it was much more artistic and imaginative and thought experiments. Well, that's what goes on in the arts. What you're doing is you're getting a vision up here of something you want, and you understand what you have to work with down here, and then all through here is a path, a set of steps you go through, and you're adjusting the whole way. So an artist, a painter, let's say, has a vision of the painting and has the palette and the white canvas and makes a stroke, looks at an adjustment, makes another stroke, another adjustment. They actually do other things, like they will do just an etching beforehand to clarify what they're doing, or work with proportions or shadowing, or I don't know what they do, but something like that. And then that stroke adjust, they produce this painting. That's the power of what the arts will teach you about design, structure, and relationships, inventiveness, and creativity. And then there's this aesthetic thing that it feeds our souls. There's this place in which we still hang on to beauty, but that falls in the domain of the artists more than the scientists. This is easy to demonstrate. Just go talk to someone. Start there. Anecdotally, it's kind of overwhelming. Never mind that we have studies that demonstrate this stuff. So learning about the arts, we engaged the kids. We had art classes for them and music, or I would get a course on music appreciation. They all played instruments. I don't think Laura did. Laura did play tennis, an athletic side. They all played tennis or hiked or played ball of some kind. They all had a taste at things, soccer and baseball and football. We were not going to be a team of great athletes. Wasn't our focus, but we did want them physically active and engaged in that activity. But for the arts, we would have art class. They all they all actually did take music. One really never gravitated to it much at all, but plenty of exposure in the arts, especially that individual was fine at painting and such, and did plenty with that and crafts and type things. I actually think when I look at the arts, I think about my son Trip. So Trip, when he left to go to the University of Texas, he went there to study actually studio art. So he got a degree in studio art and painting. It had calligraphy and sculpting and all kinds of things in it, but studio art. And people but challenged me on that idea. Say, what in the world are you having your son go to studio art or allowing him to study something he can't make a living at? And I said, well, the way I think about it, since we're trying to raise happy adults, is if a person pursues something they can really enjoy and lean into in college, they're going to do much better. They can practice and work with it. And I also think that we don't know the future, so I don't know how he might make money with it. We also realize that when you take nothing, that'd be the blank canvas, and make something, that's a great skill to have. I mean, it's just super. And so in the due course of time, he goes there, he clept out or SAT 2'd out of all the math stuff. He took some science classes as part of the curriculum was required. But he got out and has been doing, oddly enough, he went to some more schooling, and then he started working part-time and then full-time with business modeling. So a lot of what he does is related to leading teams and programming and business modeling. So they might figure out the ship channel, how ships work through the Houston Channel with one of their projects. I remember they're looking at through a modeling thing, and with computers. And I guess you could throw a hurricane in there, or storm, or disruption, or whatever. His stuff, though he's talented at that and grew in it, also his presentation stuff is also beautiful. So that comes in handy. He's gone on to get his master's in fine arts because he wants to write, and he does write. And he's also part-time teaching at a university there in Houston, Texas, a creative writing course, the Introduction to Creative Writing, something like that. They're grad students in it, so I don't know what it is. But that's the idea. That balance allows them to have their own course, physically in good shape. The body sustains the brain, intellectually in good shape. They have intellectually understood and learned the skills they need to grasp and use information. And artistically, they've learned. Most of them have written songs. They've done movies, plays. Forrest does a lot of etchings. You can see Forrest Librand on or Forrester Librand, whichever it is, on Instagram, all of the etchings he does for his novels and other things. And on and on, we see this balance of arts and intellect and exercise. And that's what I encourage you to do, to bring those things together for your child. Just add some more and, of each. You don't have to have a balance exactly the same amounts, but the right amount. And you can look at your child and see how they're doing and kind of get the idea of what they need included in the game. So there'd be the idea. And I guess I'd close with inviting you to think about two futures. And if you have a question, shoot it now so it can get through the system to me. And the two futures really look like a picture of maybe what you're doing now, and just think about where it goes. If you're not imbalanced and a child grows up and really doesn't learn to do some physical activities well, or in touch with their body, right? Or if a child is totally into reading and gaming, let's say, but never into anything in the arts and beauty and aesthetics, right? Never into exercise and moving their body outside. Imagine where that goes. Doesn't that just move that person more and more into their world? Maybe they get great at it, but they're just isolated in that gaming world. So they don't have the flexibility that I would argue is required from, the flexibility that is genuinely required for real impact, balance. Sometimes I'd even say sanity in this world. That would be that future. But then imagine the other future where your kids, you start including some art of some type, even if it's just exposure. Maybe it's learning how to draw figures from YouTube videos. It could be anything. And you start adding an art side into it to experience it. And then a little more physical exercise. We just stop, take a break until the kids run to the neighbor's house and back. It's about a block or two. I don't remember, or 5 blocks around the corner. So just to get them in motion, even that. And imagine if you bring in the physical stuff with your child and the intellectual stuff, so they're growing in that, reading more challenging literature, etc., and they're getting some exposure to art. Imagine how all that comes together to give more input, more information, more completeness, more balance to that person's life. What an awesome future that would be. And I think what you're going to hear may take a while, but probably a thank you. So there are some thoughts on how a balanced homeschool balances your kids. I hope you'll consider moving in that direction if you're not there, and improving what you're already doing. And if there are any questions, I am game, and I'll take a second because they take a second to get through the system. There's a day coming, I hope, as we continue to do this, and we're starting to see it happen. We're growing our populations of people who are watching and appreciating the videos and commenting on it. I hope there's a day that a lot of what I'll do is just get to interact with you and your questions and insights. I think that'll be cool, but I don't mind sharing a little bit about what I might know, etc. So here's somebody that threw up perfect timing. Daughter has been doing self-directed mostly for years. And self-directed be good. A lot of times, and I don't know in this situation, if the daughter is self-directed in a balanced way. So sometimes self-direction is great, but sometimes we need a little more. Yeah, so she added, got to get her well-rounded, right? Perfect timing. Second quote, got to get her well-rounded. And that's a good word. That's really a good word. There is a well-roundedness to this. That's part of what we're actually shooting for. But not perfectly balanced. We still want them to have their strengths and specialties and such, but some of each, right? Some arts and some exercise and some intellect, or a lot, maybe a lot of one or the other. Some I think are going to be more artistic than they are going to be intellectual. Some are going to be more intellectual than artistic. Some are going to be a little both. Some are going to be more physical than. But if you're physical and no intellect, that would be the dumb jock stereotype, wouldn't it? If you're artistic but no intellect, you can't keep up with your numbers and make a living. So there's the challenge. All right. I hope you found this really helpful. Very grateful you're here, and we'll see you next time, really. Right now it's tomorrow at this same time. Blessings.